Hola, ¿cómo estás? Persona que me estás viendo desde Cabo Cañaveral. Persona que me estás viendo desde Cartagena. Persona que me estás viendo desde Carlos Paz. Mi nombre es Nachito. Vamos a seguir en esto que sería como una masterclass de diseño. Único anuncio parroquial que tengo es que todavía estoy pensando bien este formato, porque no es un playthrough normal, es más parecido a una clase de diseño, así que tal vez no tiene sentido cortar los episodios en partes de una hora. Tal vez tenga sentido hacer episodios más largos, uno por cada mundo. Nada, solo avisarles que eso puede estar cambiando. Mi nombre es Nachito y vamos a ver qué tenemos hoy para aprender. Estábamos en la mitad, casi al final del mundo 2. Nos quedan estos audios por escuchar y ya seguimos al mundo 3.
But I like this part. I like jumping down the big pit. And it's a good place to appreciate some of the new animation transitions and footstep particles. As you're falling, Tim turning side to side now has like a smooth transition rather than popping between positions. And when he lands, he does some kind of he lands, he kind of catches himself with bent legs. When you land from that kind of incredible height, you should always bend your knees. You know, you don't want to land stock upright because you will like decimate your knees and your ankles. So if you fall 7 to 12 stories, bend your legs on impact.
But below 7.
Then you want to be firmly upright because it just looks cool. Looks confident.
I had a friend shatter both of his ankles not bending his knees from a 1-story drop. So he's in a wheelchair for like 6 months.
Don't jump out of windows. But yeah, there's a big plume of dust when Tim lands here. And there's also smaller plumes of dust in other cases. So please appreciate those. That's all new stuff. I mean, it just looked kind of weird before when he landed and didn't have any kind of acknowledgement of the fall.
So on 2, 3, after you go down the pit, you go straight back up the other side. Yes. And there's like guys falling down and there's compartments on the side. Mm-hmm. And I remember there being a level in like Yoshi's Island or something like that was exactly that.
Okay.
And this one's more unfair. It's like the guy comes down way faster.
Right.
And you don't get as good of an audio cue and stuff. And so it's a little bit like frustrating, right? But it's designed to illustrate this idea. The illustration may be very subtle and not gotten by a lot of people who don't think about game design, right? And so you can attempt it again and attempt it again, which you would do in a normal video game, but with a much longer sort of experiment loop, because you probably respawn somewhere earlier in the level and at cost to you,
right?
Which is why it's unfair, right? Because you lose lives or whatever.
Right.
And here it's like that doesn't happen, right? That was one of the theses in the beginning, like I said in the Moriarty talk, or about the Moriarty talk. He was like, it should be totally free. And you were like, it should just be a feature of the system.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay. So I had the high level mission statement. I am not going to cop out by making sand a resource or whatever.
Right.
I absolutely will not do that.
Right.
What I am rather instead going to do is implement the thing and then change the game however is necessary. Okay. So a Mario game by itself is proven to be, it can be a good, fun game if you do the right things.
Right.
Okay. So you can picture it as I start with a good, fun game that's just got lives and whatever.
Right.
Okay. We know what that is. Now I mess it up by putting rewind in.
Right.
It's maybe not fun. It's maybe tedious. It's maybe too easy.
Right.
The knee-jerk reaction that a designer would have is like, okay, limit rewind, or you only get it during special times.
Right.
I'm not going to do that. I'm instead, the only way out is through. I'm going to see rewind stays constant. And then what else about the game needs to change to make it something different. And I had to just have the faith that I would be able to find that, right? And that was, again, a very experimental gameplay mindset.
So it's sort of like flipping the like arrow of action. It's like saying, look, normally what you would do in game design is you would say, we have to modify the feature to fit the existing game design. And you're doing the opposite. You're saying, let's modify the existing game design to fit the feature.
Yes, and if you think about this in terms of exploring the space of game design, then obviously you don't want to retreat back into what is known, but that's what almost everybody does all the time.
And if you're modifying the feature, you're sort of by definition saying that's what you're going to do because you're keeping the other side, which is the gameplay, constant.
And I believe, I don't remember a lot of what that conversation on the mailing list was, but I bet some of it was like that. Like, well, you know, you ruin consequence and you make the game too easy and all that stuff.
Yes.
But you could mitigate that in the following ways.
Right.
And absolutely nobody said, design a whole new game around rewind.
Right. Just like make consequence not the important part or whatever. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Otro anuncio parroquial. Sé que la calidad de audio está... No sé si escucharon esto, pero es un trueno. Qué belleza. Sé que la calidad de audio está dejando mucho que desear. Tengo limitaciones de hardware, limitaciones de software, limitaciones de know-how. Ténganme paciencia, estoy haciendo todo lo que puedo. Gracias de todas maneras por aguantar y estar acá. Ya van varias veces que mencionan la charla de Moriarty y que mencionan una mailing list. Ahí tal vez no hicieron bien y no contextualizaron bien cuál fue la génesis de este juego, que yo por haber escuchado otras charlas te la puedo comentar. Por lo poco que recuerdo, la charla de Moriarty hablaba sobre el Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, donde tenés una mecánica para rebobinar el tiempo, y a eso se referían con el reloj de arena, creo que, o la arena, lo que dijeron recién, donde está limitada justamente para que vos no puedas romper el juego y para que ese no sea para que solo sea como una mecánica adicional a un juego de plataformas normal. Y en base a eso se generó una discusión en una lista de mailings, en una mailing list, donde diferentes diseñadores charlaban sobre esto, ¿no? Si es buen diseño, si no es buen diseño, cómo puede ser mejorado. Y ahí es donde, ahí sí ya cuentan recién en el audio, John dice: no caigan en la trampa. Si estás repitiendo una fórmula, no estás diseñando, estás repitiendo una fórmula. Estás tomando algo que ya sabes que funciona y le estás aplicando, y es de alguna manera, no sé, repetitivo, perezoso, no es tan interesante y no compete tanto al diseño. Diseño es poder entender las restricciones, las constraints, y poder ver en qué derivan, ¿no? ¿Cuál es la consecuencia lógica, por ejemplo, de... Bueno, todo lo que acabas de decir, no lo voy a repetir. Si tener la capacidad de rebobinar ilimitadamente te da demasiada libertad, bueno, ¿cómo usamos esa libertad? En vez de restringirte esa libertad. Y esa fue la génesis de este juego.
This part also got a lot of attention, and I repainted a lot of this stuff kind of custom all as one piece, which again is unusual. But in the original art, that central column dividing the two halves of the pit is kind of haphazardly constructed for a lot of things I already had. And there are even a couple cases where you can see the seams because they really don't fit too well. It was really kind of stretching the premise of this collage approach. In the new version, I've painted it all as one piece, and also painted unique backdrop rather than reusing foreground assets for the backdrop, and corrected or changed the lighting so the cave is actually dark in the background, so we have a more consistent use of value, which I think is more legible and creates a better sense of an interior space versus the outside.
Well, in general, I'm seeing a lot more contrast in this remaster.
Yeah, I mean, legibility is really important, and we worked on that in Braid, but I think I have a better grasp now of value and brightness and darkness as like a way to create clarity and everything. So yeah, we've added either dark or light shadows or like particles behind the foreground along its edge, so that it just stands out better.
También noté que los sprites, es decir, los personajes y los enemigos, también tienen condiciones de iluminación, fíjate. Iluminado, sombra, iluminado, sombra. La verdad, laburazo hicieron en este remaster. Repito, que me da un poco de tristeza que no se haya vendido tan bien para todo el laburo y el amor que le pusieron.
Similarly to framing the puzzles, you're also framing the castles.
Right.
That's sort of a new thing here, right?
Right. There's often kind of an empty space before the castles. And yeah, I did like wonder, is that empty space something to preserve? I mean, it's nothing to say empty space is bad. I think it kind of creates some anticipation, like you've just gotten through something and now there's kind of a break. But since it's a remake and we're looking for places to do new things, it actually seemed like a pretty good candidate for some new scenery. And so in each world, there's new stuff as you approach the castle. And I think it turned out pretty well. I think it was like not a bad decision. So here it's extending that idea of a very pretty, cultivated place, safe and harmonious, and kind of just taking the castle atmosphere and extending it outward a bit more. I like the shadow here when you go under that overhang, that Tim falls into shadow. So that's something we did wherever we could.
So what are these castles to you? What do they sort of represent to Tim in your mind?
Well, let me just get out of the way that the castles are also a familiar game trope that we all know. So we are kind of referencing the history of games and consciously using the format of a side scroller to do something with a little bit different vibe, more personal and introspective. But what they actually serve in the story, I think, is kind of representing Tim's aspiration, idealism, a castle being something really far removed from his like modern urban dwelling, but again is kind of a fantasy castle. It's not like referencing here like necessarily feudalism or like other things you might associate with like the construction of castles, but it's like something beautiful to aspire to, that his search would bring him to something transcendent.
Fin del mundo 2. Excelente. Ahora que vamos a acomodar este puzzle. Ahí está, qué bonito. ¿Estamos listos? Para no verme jugar. Primero vamos a leer el texto. Tiempo y misterio. Hace todos esos años, Tim dejó atrás a la princesa, le dio un beso en el cuello, tomó su bolsa de viaje y salió por la puerta. Hasta cierto punto se arrepiente. Ahora reanuda el viaje para buscarla, para demostrar que sabe que fue triste, pero también para decirle que fue bueno. Durante mucho tiempo pensó que tenían la relación perfecta. Él fue protector al extremo y revirtió todos sus errores para que a ella no le afectaran. De igual modo, ella controlaba sus propios errores y siempre lo complacía. Pero acomodarse totalmente en una amistad es un modo de vivir con consecuencias graves. La traducción es medio rara, vamos de vuelta. También la traducción, los subtítulos de los audios a veces traducen literalmente cosas que son expresiones, medio raro. Pero acomodarse totalmente en una amistad es un modo de vivir con consecuencias graves. Para complacerte a la perfección, debe comprenderte a la perfección. En ese caso, no puedes incumplir sus expectativas ni escapar a su alcance. Su benevolencia se limita a ti y los logros de tu vida deberán enmarcarse en el mapa que ella dibujó. Tim necesitaba evitar que lo manipularan, necesitaba una esperanza de trascendencia, necesitaba a veces ser inmune a las atenciones de la princesa. A lo lejos, Tim vio un castillo con banderas que ondeaban, aunque no hubiera viento, y el pan de la cocina siempre estaba caliente. Un poco de magia. Me gusta cómo usan, cómo lo que decían recién, ¿no? El castillo al final del nivel es un trope, es un lugar común, digamos, del diseño de juegos, que se remite también de vuelta al Mario. Es un guiño, digamos, pero encuentran maneras de hacerlo funcionar dentro del lore, lo mencionan en el texto, como que está todo atadito, ¿no? Empieza siendo arbitrario y después encuentra su lugar.
So I didn't want it to be like a story-based game in the way lots of games are, where it's about the narrative or something. Those
Right.
people drove me nuts,
Right.
like even back then.
Right.
But I like the idea, okay, so it's some kind of hybrid. I want to have some writing and I want to have some gameplay. What does that look like? Well, you know, there are illustrated storybooks,
Right.
some of which are for kids, but even
Right.
for like young adults and adults,
Mhm.
the further back in time you go, the more you see like things that are illustrated, right? And
Right.
then even old religious texts were often
Right.
just like
Yes.
illustrated, right?
Yes.
Here's Jesus dragging the cross or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, what if it's like that, an illustrated storybook, but it's kind of flipped around, where the text takes the place of the illustration in that there's like less of it and it's there more for color and flavor. And then the gameplay is like the text in the storybook is the main part, right? Is most of what you're experiencing and playing most of the time. I don't know. Also ergonomically though, if there's going to be text as an introduction, like I liked it better as an introduction in the beginning of each world to
Yeah.
help set it up than like coming in the middle or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Now, if I were text phobic, sometimes people do things that are inherently contradictory, right? They do that all the time.
Okay.
If I wanted text in the game but was scared of text in the game,
Yeah.
I would put it as little blurbs in the middle,
Right,
Or have
right.
little characters who would tell you backstory.
Right.
Like before I'd even started Braid, I think a very popular indie game was like Cave Story, right?
Right.
And it was one of these like linear story-based adventures where you meet characters and they have dialogue that gives you information about the world. So that was very clearly a model that I could have done.
Yes.
But I wanted this to be an art game, right?
Right.
That was another one of there were a lot of high-level parameters of what I was trying to do,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
I wanted it to be an art game, but unapologetically an art game, right? Because I'd been thinking about art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being made.
Una cosa que me gusta, o una de muchas cosas que me gusta de este muchacho y de otros artistas es que no le tienen miedo a ser etiquetados de snobs, de pretenciosos, ¿no? Sí, loco, es un juego de arte. ¿Y cuál hay? Sí, escribo texto y es poético y es ilustrativo y no es lo que esperás, es lo que yo quiero hacer. Chupate una mandarina. Y eso lo respeto un montón, porque dejar de hacer cosas porque sonaría pretencioso es recareta. Es lo mismo que criticas.
You know, one of the levels that shows up again in the game a few times is this level called the Pit.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
And
about
it's
that one.
super, it's one of the most minimal. It's
Yeah,
literally
it's
one
beautiful.
screen
Yeah.
and there's a pit.
Yeah.
And then what can we do with
And it
that,
happens
right?
like 5 times too, which is great.
Yeah. And so that in the original prototype,
I wanted to create a sense of like encroaching unease by starting with this forest that looks very lush and beautiful, but as it progresses would become oppressive in some way. So there are plants that are kind of increasingly fanciful and strange that become more and more dense as you go along. So that was the intention. After I finished work on World 2, we went right into World 3, and we hadn't really plotted out that trajectory through all the worlds, so the pacing wasn't as clear. So the first thing I did was actually much too abruptly jumping into something very dangerous and very ominous. It was a nighttime forest, so we had an abrupt transition to like a dark palette, blues and everything. I actually did quite a bit of painting for all that before John said, pause, this is just a lot, like this is way too dark. We need to like just take a small step towards danger here. So at that point, actually, we hadn't yet done like an overview of all the game worlds. So at that point, I said, look, we need to like plot this all out a little more. So there was some overview work I did on everything to ensure that each world would progress at the right pace towards this sort of sense of danger in human structures, and also that they would be differentiated in palette and all that stuff.
I like that it was, this is too dark. We need to step it back a little bit. And then you just went full, like, beautiful golden sunshine.
Yeah, well,
it's almost like, even further back than World 2 in some ways.
That's right. I mean, the sense of danger may kind of advance a little more later, like you go underground, or like I said, the plants become a bit oppressive. At least that's the intention. I'm not sure. You tell me how well that came across. But yeah, the danger is not like the main concept or anything here. It's really the idea of magic and kind of breaking the regular laws of the world, opening a door to something unknown, maybe dangerous.
Why is there a monster in the pit? It's easy to kill and doesn't affect the outcome of the level. I've said the game is better when it's simpler, and wouldn't it be simpler just to have a pit with only a key in it? The player could just jump in, grab the key, and rewind out. Well, a mostly empty pit didn't feel right to me. I liked the idea of you having to do something in the pit, like jump on a monster, because otherwise it's obvious upon entering the level to just look ahead and see that once you jump into this pit, you can't get out. But if there's a monster down there, it can serve as an endpoint to the thought process. It's enticing to go jump on a monster. Maybe the player kind of thinks he might be able to bounce out of the pit, or who knows what will happen. There's something to do right now, and there's ambiguity about the future, so let's just do what we can right now. The version of the pit in the original prototype had 2 monsters in the pit in order to perhaps mislead the player a bit more into thinking he might be able to double bounce out. But I later decided this was unnecessary to create the endpoint for thought, and was also a bit unfriendly because it seemed to imply much more strongly that the right answer is to double jump. So the game is directly misleading the player into repeatedly trying something unfun. Whereas with a single bounce, it's easy to see that you did it well, and how high you went as a result, and that this is nowhere near the top of the pit. The presence of the monster was reinforced when I made the World 4 version of this level, because there the monster is crucial. Without it, I couldn't see any reason to have a World 4 version of the pit at all. And when there's a monster at the bottom of the pit every time, that creates a consistent pattern that we then break for the final pit in World 6. The final, and perhaps smallest reason for the monster is, I liked that I could start the monster away from the key so that he walks forward and grabs it, making a sound cue, which causes the player's attention to be drawn to that area at the bottom of the pit shortly after the level starts, right when the player is first looking around to figure out what to do.
Además, más tarde en el juego, capaz incluso dentro de este mismo mundo, vos necesitas que uno de los monstruos agarre una llave, entonces ya te va adelantando un poco esa mecánica, tal vez la recordás. Ah, cierto que los monstruos podían agarrar llaves también.
So World 2 was sort of green and idyllic, and I think it's the most focused on drawing on your own experiences as a player. So World 3 is looking a little bit different. So what are you trying to convey with the visual difference between 2 and 3?
Well, there's a through line from World 2 to the end of increased danger and increased human presence or human-made structures. So we're connecting the second dot here with World 3 and trying to just take one small step towards danger and human structures.
Okay, so World 1 is maybe completely natural, and World 2 you're starting to incorporate, like even on the screen, like a bridge. Is it?
World 2 is completely natural, and World 3, begins to introduces this bridge, which is the first human structure you see. Well, they're trellises, but there'll be more as the thing progresses. More things made out of wood, which is comes from the forest. So it's just a small step towards like artificiality, I guess. I wanted to create a sense of like encroaching unease by starting with this forest that looks very lush and beautiful, but as it progresses would become oppressive in some way. So there are plants that are kind of increasingly fanciful and strange that become more and more dense as you go along. So that was the intention. After I finished work on World 2, we went right into World 3, and we hadn't really plotted out that trajectory through all the worlds, so the pacing wasn't as clear. So the first thing I did was actually much too abruptly jumping into something very dangerous and very ominous. It was a nighttime forest, so we had an abrupt transition to like a dark palette, blues and everything. I actually did quite a bit of painting for all that before John said, pause, this is just a lot, like this is way too dark. We need to like just take a small step towards danger here. So at that point, actually, we hadn't yet done like an overview of all the game worlds. So at that point, I said, look, we need to like plot this all out a little more. So there was some overview work I did on everything to ensure that each world would progress at the right pace towards this sort of sense of danger in human structures, and also that they would be differentiated in palette and all that stuff.
I like that it was, this is too dark. We need to step it back a little bit. And then you just went full, like, beautiful golden sunshine.
Yeah, well,
it's almost like, even further back than World 2 in some ways.
That's right. I mean, the sense of danger may kind of advance a little more later, like you go underground, or like I said, the plants become a bit oppressive. At least that's the intention. I'm not sure. You tell me how well that came across. But yeah, the danger is not like the main concept or anything here. It's really the idea of magic and kind of breaking the regular laws of the world, opening a door to something unknown, maybe dangerous.
¿Estoy loco o la mitad de ese diálogo estaba también en la otra pieza? ¿Estoy loquito? O realmente repiten tanto. En fin.
All right, so the thing that struck me the most when I played Braid was how minimalistic the puzzle design felt. And I think that was like sort of the thing that blew me away the most, maybe, I want to say. And I was wondering if you had more thoughts on that. I've sort of heard you talk about it a little bit, but maybe we can go deeper there.
That's a direction that I went more in over time, that I kind of discovered while I was working on the game. There definitely was more complex level geometry in the beginning and more monsters and stuff. I think one idea that I had early on was I want levels to fit on one screen so that they're framed, like whenever possible. Like sometimes it'll be fun to have bigger levels, but if everything fits on one screen and you're thinking about a hard puzzle, you can see all the elements right there. And you're taking away some artificial difficulty and you get to the essence of the puzzle, right? Good puzzles are going to be things where you can see all the information. And that means they're not that complicated. And I had played puzzle games where the reason the puzzle was hard is because you have to do 17 things in the right order or whatever. And I was like, no, that's not this game, because this game should be about time. Because I'd been doing experimental gameplay workshop, I had this idea that every puzzle should be on theme for the particular world. And so if something is on theme, how complicated can it be? Because if there's some specific idea about it, if that idea only takes place in one part of the puzzle, what's the rest of the puzzle doing? It's kind of dead weight on that. Unless the idea happens multiple times to like fill out. Mm-hmm. But that's hard. It's like a lot harder to design one idea taking place in multiple ways. We actually do that on the new game a little bit. And actually Zach is really good at that. He's maybe the best person I've ever seen at that particular thing. So I think that gravitated towards simpler puzzles, but also just sometimes I would be working on a puzzle and I would be unhappy with it because it looks ugly, or just this thing is weird. And then I would delete the thing that was weird and I would like it more. And I kept seeing that trend. I was like, okay, this game is better when I'm more minimal. But that was only something that I really had clarity about, I would say, by the middle or 2/3 of the way through development, for sure.
Me gusta un montón la idea de dificultad artificial. Que en gran parte la acaba de explicar John y seguramente va a seguir profundizando luego, así que no tiene mucho sentido que me ponga a explicarla, pero me gusta. ¿Por qué me gusta? Me gusta porque a mí personalmente implica que te esforzaste intelectualmente como diseñador y no recurriste a trucos baratos para inflar la dificultad y justificar por ejemplo, mayor tiempo de gameplay. Una métrica que se está usando mucho ahora, por ejemplo, para cotizar ciertos desarrollos de juego o para saber si es un juego grande, chico, cuál es la expectativa de la vida útil de ese juego. Como en una película podrías decir, che, ¿es una película de 1 hora y media o es una película de 3 horas? Pero no es lo mismo. Bueno, en el caso de los juegos se está usando la métrica de las horas de juego, promedio, por supuesto, ¿no? Un juego de 10, 20 horas se considera corto, un juego de 100, 120 horas, medio, un juego de 200, 250 horas se considera un juego largo. Y si sos intelectualmente deshonesto o perezoso, vas a querer inflar esas horas por medio de lo que John llamaría dificultad artificial, ¿no? Te meto más enemigos para que tengas más cosas para hacer, para que sea un poco más difícil. Entonces estoy chequeando todas las cajas, ¿no? Te estoy dando un desafío, estoy levantando las horas de engagement, como lo diríamos en tiempos modernos de producción de contenido. Pero es artificial y me gusta mucho. Incluso como consumidor, cuando encuentro un juego o una experiencia que respeta mi tiempo, ¿no? O me respeta intelectualmente y no me hace hacer, por ejemplo, la misma cosa muchas veces cuando ya la sé hacer, ya no me suma nada a mi experiencia. Déjame proseguir al próximo nivel, por más que eso te cueste a vos, que yo voy a estar 1 hora menos, 10 horas menos, interactuando con tu juego. Sería lo natural en comparación con lo artificial. No, ¿qué hice? Qué pelotudo.
For this puzzle to work, the wall must shut before you can make the round trip of getting up to the key and back down to unlock the gate. The wall slams into the floor at around 17 seconds, signaling obvious failure, but already by 13 seconds, you could no longer fit through. So, when we are planning out the level, the path to the key and back must take longer than 13 seconds, preferably around 17 seconds, so that it's very obvious to the player that he didn't almost make it. You can fall faster than you can climb, so an advanced player will drop from the trellises on the way down, and this must be taken into account when determining the travel distance. If you start designing with nothing but the basic idea of you can't get there in time, and you're just trying to think of what the level geometry should be, the simplest way to imagine it is to make the level very, very wide and flat horizontally, so that there's a very obvious long distance that the player must travel. But as mentioned elsewhere, we generally try to keep levels fitting on one screen when we can for greater understandability. And in this level, that's even more important. If the level were wide and horizontal, the wall would scroll off the screen so you can't see it anymore, and you would have much less certainty about how much time is left and whether you could beat it or not. You'd only know when you got back. For these reasons, the level is authored in a zigzag pattern fitting on one screen.
Lo cual, topológicamente, podríamos decir que es indistinguible de que el nivel sea largo, porque es exactamente lo mismo, solo que doblado sobre sí mismo. Y bueno, con la mecánica añadida de tener que trepar y caer. Pero en topología es la misma cosa. En topología, una taza de café es lo mismo que una dona, para que se entienda. Búscalo. Por si no entendés lo que acaba de pasar, voy a explicarlo porque tal vez me olvido de explicar las mecánicas. Las paso porque asumo que ya se entiende, porque yo ya jugué este juego. Pero lo que tendrías que haber identificado en el nivel anterior, y estás reconfirmando en este nivel cuando lo estás jugando, es que los objetos que brillan de verde son inmunes a las mecánicas de rebobinar el tiempo. Con lo cual, este nivel en particular está pensado para que vos intentes escalar hasta arriba y bajar con la llave y en ese momento te das cuenta que no haces a tiempo, no tenés manera. Entonces la solución tiene que ser recurrir a la mecánica de rebobinar, donde la secuencia lógica de eventos sería: voy hasta la llave, la agarro, una vez que tengo en la mano rebobino. Como esa llave está en mi mano y es inmune a rebobinar el tiempo, y yo retrocedo, la puerta retrocede, se vuelve a subir, pero la llave se viene conmigo y de esa manera llego antes de que se cierre del todo. Esa sería la lamparita que se te tiene que prender para resolver este acertijo. Siempre hago lo mismo.
In the original Braid game, there were no ambient sounds except for, I think, 2 levels that had a simple rain loop. And there wasn't any sound of Tim moving around, so most of the time there's only music and some specific gameplay sounds. So in that sense, Braid is a good example of very simplistic or minimalistic game audio, which is you only hear the sound effects that serve a direct purpose of communicating stuff that happens in gameplay, like a cannon shooting or a door opening or a platform moving. And then also the sounds that give player feedback, like you jumped, you grabbed a ladder, you killed a monster, etc. This is a very basic use of sound in video games. You could call that old school or arcade
Eso
style.
estaba en el original.
But in a way you can
Esos
compare
sonidos.
this to only having artwork the gameplay layer, but not the background. So, I mean, imagine the background was only black like in very old arcade games. But just like the background artwork serves a purpose of creating a setting and a mood and some overall beauty to the game, of course, the background sound design of a game can help create the setting and give it some texture. We can't feel the materials with our hands and we can't smell the environment, of course, but with proper sound design we can get pretty close. And with a game like Braid that already put a lot of attention into the mood and atmosphere, we felt that there was a great unused potential here for enhancing that even further with ambience and Foley sounds. So what started out as a task of remastering the original sound effects soon became a task of adding a whole new dimension to the game. Ambient sounds make use of the original sound system in Braid, which means it's a single basic loop that plays. But where the original rain loop in these 2 levels I mentioned was only 6 seconds long and thereby felt very static, we now use durations of 30 plus seconds, giving it constant, imperceptible variation. We designed an ambience loop for each level carefully, so it was clear and focused and with no static or noisy elements. And this actually enables us to put them quite low in the mix, so just like with the graphics, there's a clear distinction between the gameplay elements and the background. Like with the music remastering, we introduced this change from the original game gradually, so the first levels are done gently and with respect for the original, then the later levels are much more abstract and designed soundscapes. So, now that the world had sound, Tim started to feel very detached from that world because he moves around completely silent. So we needed to add some sound to him as well, and here the programmers added a new system that plays footsteps and clothes sounds when Tim walks, depending on the surface material he walks on, of course. And this is then used very subtly and doesn't really take much attention, but the fact that there is a faint noise when he moves around connects him more to the world, and in that sense, connects the player more to the game. A lot of the time you won't hear the ambience of Foley at all, we hope, as they are masked by the music, but since the music is very dynamic, it allows the ambience level to be static but still feel like it was turned up and down while playing. A small curiosity is that it seemed to us that even when the ambience is just a faint wind, this constant noise that it brings actually adds to the feeling of high definition sound. We actually felt that when switching back and forth between the old and the new version, this noise kind of made it sound clearer, and that was even before the music was remastered. So that's in a way ironic that more noise gave the feel of clearer sound.
Estoy viendo cuántos audios hay. Ok. Me gusta que la cámara, observé en el último episodio que también repensaron algunos temas del movimiento de la cámara. Y acá se usa mucho para delimitar que son dos puzzles separados. A ver si en la versión vieja se mueve de la misma forma la cámara. Encuadra igual, pero es un poco más brusco, ¿no? Bueno.
I mean, this is so awesome because now we're coupling like time and space. So now we're really starting to use the rewind to control the relative position of these clouds, which, and change them from something we can't jump over to something we can. And that's really interesting, and it's really fun to play with the fact that half the clouds rewind, the other half don't. And of course, this gets deeper farther on in the game.
Of course, that, again, we start out designing one of these worlds, and the question is, again, what can you do? And I was in the mindset of what's the most minimal thing that I can do given this feature, technical or gameplay feature, that some things don't rewind, right? In the very original prototype of the game, it wasn't quite like this. It wasn't a property of objects. It was just like, there was just the magic key, right? And the magic key wouldn't rewind, right?
Right.
And then
why not other things?
Yeah. Well, I realized later, the way we do the magic key is by excluding it from the rewind loop. So like, let's just have that be a property that could or might not be attached to any particular thing, right? So I was thinking, what's the most minimal thing you can do? And came up with this, and I like it, right? As always, when trying to balance, platformer with puzzle, it's a little bit harder than I wish it was in some ways, in the following way. So I said before, sometimes people miss jumps and they don't realize yet that they can rewind because they're not used to a game that has rewind, right? By the time people get here, probably they have used rewind a bunch and they remember it more. And the problem here is that you very carefully set this thing up, right? And by now, people might be rewinding. And when they rewind, they mess up. And if they rewind to a point when they were over one of the non-rewindable clouds, they'll fall earlier. It's like, it becomes a little more frustrating even than it should be, right? So of course, the right thing to do is be patient and line them up again. But if you do that too soon, you'll fly back up into the air, right? So you want to stand on the ground for a little bit, right? Hold on, rewind the right amount, get them in phase, and then not miss the jump, right? And of course, you can do things that are messier than that. That's like a very deliberate way to solve it. You can do things that are messier, but they're more frustrating, right? So,
But I also like this element of it because now that there are objects in the world that don't rewind, it means that it might be a little tricky to recover the state you wanted. It means that, rewind is not just an undo. It's going to change some aspects of the world and not change others, and it's going to be a little complicated. And you start to sense that rewind is going to be this very dynamic element in your strategy.
Esta flor no hacía nada. Estoy bastante seguro que esta flor tenía una función. Capaz te ayudaba a conseguir una estrella o algo así.
I like this one because at first you're like, okay, so I know how to do this because I just saw the previous puzzle, but oh wait, that's just too far. And one thing I did this thing that I call wiggle time, where you like repeatedly tap the backspace button a little bit until things are in just the right place. And
I see.
But yeah.
And now that's, again, something easy to mess up, because if you rewind too far, now you're in the air again, right? So
that's true.
You have to be a little bit patient and tap, but it works.
Yeah, I guess I didn't mind that.
Yeah.
So
when I design a puzzle like this, I'm thinking about how it's perceived, because that's part of what I'm trying to make in a game like this is not just the puzzle, right? But the experience of seeing the puzzle and what do you think when you see the puzzle, right? And in this one, it's pretty clearly just like the one you just did, longer distance and, sort of bigger gap. Like, I just like the thought process of like, oh, it looks like I do the same thing, but I can't really do the same thing. And the way that I think about the difference between these two, which may or may not be the way any player ever does, right? But the difference is this one on the left is solvable statically. Like you can rewind.
There's one move.
Yeah. You rewind till the things are in the right spacing and then you go, right? And then if you don't mess up when you go, you get the puzzle piece, right? On the right-hand side, that is not the case, right?
And you have to rewind more dynamically.
Yeah, in the middle of progress across the gap, you must use rewind in some way, and that's the difference between them.
Yeah, so it's sort of building up the virtuosity of the player in how they use rewind as a tool. There's also, there's a design element here which shows up later on, which is this long shelf above all this, which makes one kind of curious, like, why is that there? Because almost everything in the game is there for a reason, and is this, what's going on?
Seems very extraneous.
And maybe this time around it is, but later it isn't, and that's kind of nice.
So, a little bit about the cloud cannons and the fuses. Originally, this world was very silent with only music playing, no rain and almost no cloud cannons. The cloud cannons had a very faint and abstract poof when shooting, and an almost inaudible sound when the clouds disappeared. And in our opinion, these sounds did not really connect well with the actual cannons. We wanted to create a much richer and more forceful sound that could give the cannons some weight, but also some beauty, and that the player would instinctively understand as coming from the cannons. We also felt there was a great unused potential for creating something very poetic in this level. The autumn feel of the colors and the rain combined with the very slow nature of these puzzles, and also the music piece, Romanesca, that is only heard here and then once again much longer into the game. A natural idea was to play with the sound of thunder that in an abstract way could connect both the cannons, the clouds and the rain, and even add to the poetry. So this is how they ended up. Another thing that wasn't in the original game was the sound of the fuses. They were there visually to indicate when the cannons will shoot, but it made sense to give that gameplay hint through audio as well. In this specific level, we have some of the slowest fuses in the game, and they are almost burning constantly. So a constant sound like this would not communicate gameplay very well and also be a very annoying static noise. Instead, we had the fuses sound only when they ignite, and then again half a second up until the actual shot. The rest of the time they are still dead quiet. And then finally we added rain, of course. Not rain as in constant white noise, but rather sporadic big wet drops in leaves and in puddles.
A ver si se escucha la diferencia entre el viejo y el nuevo. Recién ahora me estoy dando cuenta que tal vez eso también cambia, no solo las visuales. Increíble, cuando empezás a prestar atención el cambio es muy notorio. Lo mismo que con las visuales, si no le estás prestando atención, bueno, sí, mejoró un poco la resolución. Cuando le empezás a prestar atención hay un detalle, una fineza y una técnica muy sofisticadas.
David mentioned doing an initial, darker version of the World 3 art, and that we then had a discussion about it and changed direction. When I realized that it felt wrong for what I was trying to do with the game, this seemed like a pretty uncomfortable conversation to have. There was a fair amount of art done for World 3 already, and it's a pretty negative thing to say, hey, stop, we have to redo this, and not use the work you've done on it so far, especially when you think the other party may not understand why you want to redo it, because what's there looks fine. Fortunately, David was a good sport about it, and before too long, we got to the current World 3. Since then, I've become familiar with this kind of activity. It's a basic part of my job and happens a couple of times every game. If you're trying to make something that feels well put together, while successfully doing something subtle with mood or theme, it can actually be quite delicate, and it's easy for a bad ingredient to ruin the soup. Someone has to be tasting this soup and occasionally say, no, this ingredient isn't the right one to get where we are trying to go. Another such conversation came up later on that was even harder. Before David had come on the project, when I was having a hard time finding an artist to do everything, I worked for a bit with Edmund McMillan, who has since become well known for games such as The Binding of Isaac and Super Meat Boy. Back then, both he and I were unknown. He was working on other projects with the majority of his time, but he did art and animation for all the characters, which was very helpful in terms of making the game something better looking that people could actually play. After this, David came onto the project and did a larger volume of art for all the level's foreground and background objects. This took quite a while, and when it was done, I felt like I had a serious problem in that the game's overall art style was not coherent. Edmund's art is in a cartoony style, and David's looks like you see today, and the two just didn't mesh well together. They didn't create a uniform feel. I agonized over this for a bit, then said, hey, David, we need you to paint over Edmund's stuff in order to make the visuals uniform. And I informed Edmund of this as well. Most of the resulting characters hew closely to Edmund's designs, except for Tim, for whom we went through several revisions because I felt his look was key to the mood of the game. I felt bad that we painted over Edmund's stuff, but with years of hindsight, it was still clearly the right decision. But I suspect that a lot of newer independent developers would not have conversations like this because they're uncomfortable and may cause drama. It's much safer just to avoid the conflict and just roll ahead with the game that you have. But when it's the right thing for the game, you really should do it.
Sí, deberías hacerlo. La única razón para no hacerlo es limitaciones presupuestarias. Esto es, no tenemos plata para que vuelvas a pintar todo de vuelta. Sale así, buscamos otra solución. Ahora, querer ser delicado con el frágil ego de un artista, y si tu ego es tan frágil, tal vez deberías dedicarte a otra cosa. Y es comprensible porque el arte es muy personal, ¿no? Existe el vocablo estar casado con lo que hiciste, ¿no? Y más si te dejaron un montón de tiempo sin revisar y vos hiciste un mundo entero, todo de noche, por ejemplo, como sucedió acá. Y un día te estás desayunando que, che, bueno, no, todo ese laburo se cajonea, se hace todo de vuelta. Podés no estar casado e igual estar molesto de que te hayan dejado progresar tanto sin decirte, sin frenarte, ¿no? Cosas que pasan en todos los procesos de diseño. A ver a dónde nos lleva esto. A la charla que hablaba sobre esto. Acá es donde el juego se empieza a poner un poquito más complejo. Recuerdo, por ejemplo, que a este puzzle que estamos viendo ahora yo tuve que volver más tarde. No lo resolví a la primera. Acá es donde empecé a renegar. Allá por el 2008. Vamos a escuchar este audio y terminar este episodio. Porque queda un montón de mundo después de esto.
So let's see. Is this The Ground Beneath Her Feet?
Named after a novel by Salman Rushdie.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah. I just really enjoyed it when I read it. And sometimes, okay, here's, it's a very amateur thing to do. Like when you're making something to put like, oh, my favorite band has a song and let me put a poster from them in my game or whatever, right? But sometimes I do that a little bit. It's okay. I do. Yeah, it happens a few times in this game, and yeah.
I mean,
it's fine.
Like I teach a subject, computer science, that people think is just a totally recent invention, and it has these very deep historical and intellectual roots. And I like pointing those out to people, that it goes deeper than they think. So I think it's really good to connect things to some other cultural works, older cultural works. I think it reminds you that this is part of a larger intellectual whole. I know not everybody's into that, but
it's also, so the reason it feels like an amateur thing to me is because when you don't have that many of your own ideas, it feels like ideas, right? Like, oh, especially for like, because being, I don't know how much I subscribe to some of these social lines that get drawn, but being a member of Generation X and like pop culture references being a thing, it's just one of those. And I don't know. I feel weird about it, but it's fine.
Había un malo cuando arrancamos el nivel, porque si no, no recuerdo cómo alcanzar esa pieza. Vamos a resolver esto rápidamente. Sí, señor. Y en este caso, lo que habría que hacer es... Lo dejamos morir, no pasa nada, pero... Activamos esto. Volvemos atrás. Venga con papi. Y ahora... Tuki. Tuki. Hemos resuelto este nivel. Capaz nos queda solo un audio más y ya podemos terminar este episodio junto con este nivel. Ya dije lo mucho que me gusta la música.
I remember doing the layout for the background here, and there were a lot more pieces. It was tricky to get the parallax values and the depth values not to conflict. You see this tree towards the end of the level after the last spike pit is broken into a lot more parallax layers. As you go back and forth, it has an enhanced sense of depth.
A ver. tenés una capa para el tronco principal, otra para la rama que está más adelante, que es muy sutil pero se está moviendo. Y tenés al menos 2, 3, 4, 5 capas de hojas. De vuelta, si no estás prestando atención, si no te dicen que eso sucede, ni lo notás. Estoy viendo que el árbol que tengo atrás ahora también, diferentes ramas están en diferentes capas. Cosa que acá no sucede. Y a ver acá. Tampoco. Bien. ¿Qué hemos aprendido hoy? Hemos aprendido que está bien herir el frágil ego de los artistas. Hemos aprendido que está bien hacer referencias a cultura pop. Al menos eso, generación X. Hemos aprendido algunos temas de economía, de elementos de puzzle, cómo encajar elementos de puzzle en una sola pantalla y por qué hacerlo. Y hemos charlado un poco sobre dificultad artificial, entre otras cosas. Y hemos aprendido un montón sobre procesos de arte visual y sonoro, sound design. Temas muy sutiles, muy delicados. Y que cuanto más pones a verlo y a escucharlo, le seguís encontrando cosas. No es infinito, pero es mucho más detallado de lo que uno ve a la primera. Mi nombre es Nachito. Espero que estés entretenido, entretenida, aprendiendo, divirtiéndote o lo que sea. No sé por qué estás acá, pero espero que lo estés disfrutando. De ser así, déjame un engagement, un like, un comentario, algo, para que yo sepa que voy por la senda del bien, que este contenido está bueno, efectivamente, que no le estoy hablando a una pared, salvo que seas una pared. Mi nombre es Nachito y nos vemos en el próximo episodio.